Hey everybody, welcome back to Truth Revealed. I'm your host, Sergio Denaro. I'm a former human intelligence collector and retired federal agent for the US government. Today, I'm going to be analyzing Brian Higgins' witness testimony. Even though the Karen Read trial has ended, there should be more charges brought in this case because it was very clear just in the initial assessments that we did from witness testimony from Jen McCabe and Colin Albert, Karen Read did not hit John O'Keefe. At this point, what we want to figure out who the murderer is. I'm coming off a little bit of a high from analyzing the Alec Baldwin case, where I looked at Seth Kenney and found out that he was the true saboteur and murderer in that case. Let's keep rolling with this and let's expose some murderers here. A little bit of a spoiler alert. I am going to give you definitive proof. I mean, this borders on evidence here. Anybody can see this. When I point this out to you, it's going to become crystal clear. You don't need any deception detection training to see there is a lie in this statement that it's tantamount to a confession. I mean, there's no way that you can misread this. There's no question that Brian Higgins played a large role in John O'Keefe's death. Before we get started, let's talk about his baseline. His baseline is very direct, very normal. He uses past tense like a normal person. Everything about his baseline is very normal. In fact, I'm going to throw in just a couple questions in here so that you can see when he's asked a question that's not sensitive, he just answers it and talks directly in the right tense. He just talks like a normal person. Because I'm only going to show you relevant questions, you're going to see just deception after deception after deception, and you might start to think that's his baseline, and it is not his baseline. I'm literally cutting out all of the irrelevant questions that don't bring out deception in him. Be aware of that. Something else that we notice in this statement is that Higgins will continuously use reduction in commitment statements like, I believe, maybe, to the best of my knowledge, or to the best of my recollection, statements like that. You almost want to classify that as baseline, but it's not baseline. When somebody uses those statements continuously throughout the whole statement, it's a general indicator as opposed to a specific indicator of deception. When you have general indicators of deception, it means that their entire testimony is deceptive as a whole. Whatever the main accusation is, they're guilty of it. It really is that simple. The only thing I want to talk about in our pregame lesson here is how to judge whether a action that seems trivial, is it a right action, is it a wrong action, or is it actually a zero consequence action? The example that I usually give in my class is my daughter comes home from school, there's a TV show that she wants to watch, and she has homework, and she says, Dad, can I just skip doing my homework tonight? I really want to watch this show. It's the last season finale, whatever. And I know this stuff inside and out. If I miss one day of homework, I already have 100% in the class. It's not going to make any difference at all whatsoever. Is that really a zero-sum statement? The way that you can figure that out, and it works with everything, is take it to its logical extreme and figure out, if you do that, are the consequences positive or negative, or are they actually a zero-sum consequence? If you skip all of your homework all of the time, then obviously there's a tremendously negative consequence there. That's an example of how to use this scale. If you're trying to determine whether something is truly inconsequential or if it actually has a negative slant to it, just blow it up to its logical extreme and you'll see very quickly whether or not that is slightly positive or slightly negative, even if it's difficult to measure on the spot. So here we go. And why were you in New York City, sir? I was in New York City for the funeral services of Officer Moore and Rivera, who killed in the line of duty. We have I repeated 3 times. We have I was in New York City for the funeral services. This repeating of I 3 times means Higgins didn't go to the funeral. Repeating a pronoun, especially the pronoun I, is an indicator of sensitivity. The more often it's repeated, the greater the sensitivity. If somebody repeats I once, if you just say I, that's a low level of sensitivity that you want to pay attention to. If they say I 3 times, you have deception in that statement. If it gets 4, 5, 6 times, the deception is so extreme that they're basically in life or death mode at that point. This is an example right here of what we talked about in that lesson. If you say I twice, you might be thinking, that doesn't mean anything. Sometimes people just repeat a word, I. Well, if you take that to its logical extreme and repeat I 30 times before you say something, I, you realize quickly, no, something's wrong there. When you start to repeat a word, there's a problem there. It's you're editing and you're thinking about something in the future. How difficult it is for you to edit that is how many times you're going to repeat the word I. So it is not something that people normally do. When he's answering baseline questions, like what kind of car do you drive? He says, I drive a Jeep, or I drove a Dodge Ram truck to New York. So the fact that he repeats I 3 times means that most likely he went to New York. He took advantage of there being a funeral to take a little personal trip. When did you go to New York City? I believe it was the 27th of February. Might have been Thursday. There's no reason to be reducing commitment here. It obviously was the 27th of February, and might have been Thursday. What this tells me is, number one, going to reduce commitment everywhere, most likely. And it also calls everything that he says into question. I believe it was the 27th of February, might have been a Thursday, means that he might have went on the 26th, which means it might have been a Wednesday. That's something that we'll have to keep in mind. Every time we see I believe, it means that there's no commitment. We have to pay attention to that. I believe before known fact means that he will use this phrase for things he is certain of being true. However, this still remains a reduction of commitment. If this continues, it becomes a theme, which is a strong indicator that he is deceptive about the main issue at hand. Spoiler alert, he is deceptive about the issue at hand. What kind of government vehicle was it that you drove down and back? That was a Dodge Ram pickup. So this is a good baseline answer. There's no stuttering. There's no nothing. Direct. After dropping them off there, where did you go? This is already on the way back. I went back to the Canton Police Department where I dropped off Kevin Albert and then switched vehicles, got into my Jeep Wrangler, and I traveled up to the hillside in Canton. That's another baseline response. This was a pretty lengthy response, actually, for him. He's very direct. You're really not going to get an explanation of a simple question that's longer than 3 lines. This is very direct. It's in the correct tense. There's no stuttering. And it's 3 lines. It gives you a good amount of description that fully and completely answers the question, and then he's done. We have a good baseline, and he does this continuously. I'm just giving you one example. As far as traveling up to the hillside in Canton, who, if anyone, did you have plans with? He says, Brian Albert agreed to meet me there. So what does this tell us? Number one, it tells us by the word agreed means that Higgins asked Albert to go there, and Albert agreed to go there with him. Is that pertinent later? At this point, I'm not sure, but it's just good for us to know. The more information we have, the better. So we know that Higgins asked Albert to go there and Albert agreed. And then repeating to means the topic is likely a touchy subject. Most likely there was a topic of conversation that Higgins wanted to talk to Albert about. Now I have no indication at this point what that was. I just know that Higgins wanted to talk to Albert about something. The plow that you affixed to the Jeep Wrangler, how big a plow are we talking about? And Higgins says, if I was to guess, it would probably 6 feet 8 inches. I believe they make them in 2 formats, 6.8 and I think 7.2. But I believe I have the smaller blade on that Jeep. There's too much reduction of commitment here. ROC, reduction of commitment, around the plow. If I was to guess, I believe, I think, I believe, that is an awful lot of reduction of commitment. That tells me that the plow is a sensitive topic for him because he's actually giving you very specific information about the plow. When he says they make it in 2 formats, they make 6.8 and 7.2, and I have the smaller one. Why is there any sensitivity at all around that? Because the plow itself is a sensitive topic for Higgins. You go to the hillside, and do you know about what time it was that you got there? Time is important. Time is one of the 5 things that we're always going to be looking for in statements. If we're going to nail down exactly when things happen and who was where, we have to get a good timeline. So anytime you see somebody who is in a position where they could be accused of a crime, especially a murder, and you have a very hard time getting any sort of a timeline from them, it's a huge indicator of deception. No, again, it would have been after I had dropped off Kevin Albert, definitely would have been dark at that time. We have after. After I dropped off Kevin Albert. After means there is an action that occurred. An action takes time. In deception detection, we call that missing time. But what we're really referring to is a missing action. We have missing time in this statement. After I had dropped off Kevin Albert, in the process of dropping off Kevin Albert, he did something else, and he's not willing to tell you what he did there. Definitely would have been dark at that time. That is an extremely generic statement. Basically tells you what? That it was after 5 p.m. He's not willing to tell you what time it was. And once you got to the hillside, how long were you there, and how long was Mr. Albert there? So I had something to eat, I had something to drink, the approximate time, maybe an hour or so. And then Brian left before me, I remained, he left. Left is an important word because when somebody leaves a place, they are either late, 70% of the time when somebody uses the word late, when they use the word left, it means they're late. The other 30% of the time, it's an indication of conflict. What we want to do is try to determine if Brian Albert was running late. I would say that our indication here is that he probably was, even though Higgins repeats left twice, which seems like a pretty strong indicator of sensitivity here and of potential conflict. The fact that Brian Albert had to go meet his family at a different location. The conversation probably got cut short and Albert was running late. So that's why you see left twice here. I don't think it's actually meaningful to us here. About how long before you left was it that Brian Albert that, and he says maybe 15 minutes. Why did Higgins wait 15 minutes after Albert left? Why didn't he just go with him? Normally people, if they decide they're going to go together to a location, they will actually go together. Even if they're driving separately, they'll go at the same time. That tells me that there was something going on there that Higgins wanted information about before he went. And as far as where Mr. Albert was going, what, if any, conversation did you have about that? He had told me that he was going down to the Waterfall Bar and Grill, which is in Canton Center, and that he'd be meeting his wife and some family and maybe some other people. Higgins either has tremendous sensitivity with Nicole or with maybe some other people. As I'm going through this, I'm going to keep an open mind. This could be either or. Now, because of the facts that we know that the other people that were there ends up being O'Keefe and Reed, we figure out pretty quickly that the sensitivity with his is about the maybe other people. It's not about Nicole. Extreme sensitivity, though, regarding the people when he repeats that 3 times. And if you know about what time it was that you got to the waterfall, again, it was dark, which means, again, I'm not going to tell you times. It could have been around 9, in the area of 9. Again, we see sensitivity around the time. Now, with respect to Brian Albert, how would you describe your relationship around this time in January? Now, this is interesting because he says in January, as opposed to just how was your relationship with Brian? I think this is a question that got away from ADA Lally. He works very hard at trying not to incriminate Higgins, but this question, he didn't see anything wrong with the way that he phrased this, and we get an interesting response. He says, he's a good friend. He's a coworker. I had been working closely with his unit. I tell you, he was a good friend. Higgins has already introduced Albert, and he just introduces him as essentially an acquaintance. He introduces him at exactly the same level in his mind as the other people that are coming back. He doesn't say, Brian Albert rode in the truck back. Brian Albert was a great friend of mine, and he's a detective. He just introduces him as Brian Albert. He's a detective at Boston Police, and he doesn't get any special treatment there. But when he's asked a question about your relationship around this time in January, that changes. You get a change of language here. And he says, he's a good friend. He's a coworker. And then he, even saying he's a good friend, that's not enough. Like, he has elevated Brian Albert, but he wants to elevate him again. And then he says, which is an indicator of withholding information, deception. And here it's an indicator of withholding why he gets elevated, why his status has been elevated. He says, I tell you, he was a good friend. Now that is like, he's got my back kind of a thing. So he got elevated twice in this one question. And that is extremely meaningful to us. This is an elevation of Albert's status in Higgins' eyes. This is an indicator that in January, Albert proved himself to Higgins to be a good friend. Albert would have had to have done something for Higgins that Higgins viewed as going above and beyond during the month of January, as January is mentioned in the question. The repeating I indicates that the reason for the elevation in status is being omitted. And who, if anyone else, was there that you were familiar with or that you knew when you came? So it would have been Brian Albert. It would have been Nicole. I believe Caitlin was there. Brian, Caitlin, Albert, Brian's daughter, Chris Albert, his wife, Julie, Matt McCabe. So he's just listing people at this point. Higgins was under stress when he entered the bar regarding who would be there. So repeating it indicates that he was under stress. The would indicates that he was thinking about the future when he entered the bar. Higgins was stressed about either O'Keefe or Reed or both of them coming to the bar. So it would have been, as he got there and he identifies the people, he was under stress. And so you see stress in his language. And then once he realizes O'Keefe and Reed are not there, which is probably the information that he was waiting to hear from Brian Albert before he left to go meet him there. When he got there, he's still under stress. He wants to go in there and make sure that O'Keefe and Reed didn't show up while he was driving. And that's just an indicator that that's stressful for him. Between the time that you arrived and the time that the band's wrapping up and you're preparing to leave, who, if anyone else, were you familiar with that came into the waterfall? He says, John O'Keefe and the defendant. This is the first time that we get introduced to John O'Keefe by Brian Higgins. So it's important to us. We want to pay attention how he introduces people and how he talks about those people. And if their title changes, it's John O'Keefe. How often would it be that you saw Mr. O'Keefe or socialized with Mr. O'Keefe? I would, now that we're talking about John O'Keefe, we start to see sensitivity here. I would see him at the hillside. This is one short sentence and you have two repeating phrases in this sentence. I would indicates that he is not pulling from memory. It's not deception because the speaker is present day Higgins and not past Higgins. We are seeing stress in Higgins' language at the mention of O'Keefe. How often would it be that you saw Mr. O'Keefe? If he was actually recalling a memory that was before any of the conflict, you wouldn't see any indicators of sensitivity or stress in his language. But we are seeing, we want to see, is he recalling a memory or is he injecting from the present? Remember, in the present, it's after the fact, after John O'Keefe's death. He indicates, indicates that he's not pulling from memory, which means we would expect to see sensitivity in the language if he played a role in John O'Keefe's death. This is a red flag from a language standpoint. It's very important to Higgins in that it means the end of his freedom and the end of his life if he's caught. So his death has a meaning that it shouldn't have otherwise, and it makes it very sensitive. It should not impact his language if he played no part in O'Keefe's death. When I say stress, I mean the stress of being deceptive and the stress of having guilt in your mind that's working against you while you're talking. If somebody is under the emotional stress of the loss of somebody, like the example where Karen Reed is saying, did I hit him? Could I have hit him? You're not going to see indicators of deception from a truthful person who is under stress because they're not deceptive. When I say stress, I mean only the stress of being deceptive, not the stress of losing a loved one. Her language of, did I hit him? Could I have hit him? There's no deception in those. Those are simple, straightforward questions. Would there be occasions where you would see Mr. O'Keefe without Miss Reed, or you would see Miss Reed without Mr. O'Keefe, or are they essentially together when you saw them? This question is terrible. It's so bad that I have to actually do some analysis of the question here, because when you phrase something like this, there's no wrong way to answer it. This gives me the impression that ADA Lally has knowledge of Higgins's guilt and that he is very purposefully phrasing questions so as to not implicate Higgins. You might make the argument that anything that would undermine his case against Miss Reed would be something that he would want to avoid. But his job as the prosecutor is very different than as the defense attorney. The prosecutor should be on the lookout for anything that would indicate that he is prosecuting the wrong person. The fact that it looks like he's trying to cover up information here is very disturbing. It's something we want to pay close attention to. And then Higgins says, I would say more often than not, they'd be together, which is an absolutely meaningless statement. Lally is trying to skirt the real question here, and Higgins takes the courtesy and provides a meaningless answer. This indicates that Lally might believe that Higgins committed the murder and is consciously trying not to reveal any evidence that he has against Higgins. We need to look for these types of statements in the future. Simply seeing this once is not an indicator of guilt. We need to simply be aware that we saw this and continue to see if we have any other indicators that pop up in the future. Why is this question so bad? It's because we know that Lally knows that Higgins was having some sort of a relationship with Reed at this point. So the real question here should be, would there be occasions where you would see Mr. O'Keefe without Miss Reed, period? And then you want the answer to that question. And then he would say, have you ever seen Miss Reed without Mr. O'Keefe? And that's going to bring out a whole bunch of different information about how much time he spent with Karen Reed without John O'Keefe there. But that implicates him. That is very damaging information to Higgins. For Lally to feel like he needs to ask the question, but then to ask it in a way that you can't get any information from is very telling. So we'll keep our eyes open for that. Did you have occasion to see them in other social settings outside of the hillside? He says, I went over the house one time before the end of a Patriots game. Over the house, there's a couple things wrong with this. Improper pronoun, the, indicates that he went to the house for Reed, not for O'Keefe. We have, I went over, he left out to, which is not maybe necessarily a huge deal, but it's in combination with removing his. It should be his house. This is O'Keefe's house. And he removed the pronoun. When you remove the pronoun his, it means he didn't go to the house to see O'Keefe. He went to the house, which means he went to Karen Reed's house, even though she doesn't own the house. He didn't go to see O'Keefe. He went to see Reed, is what this tells you. One time before the end of a Patriots game. Before is a missing time statement. Something happened that he doesn't want you to know about, and it's going to tie directly to the improper pronoun here, the missing possessive pronoun. Higgins was invited to the game by Reed and doesn't want to give that information. Thus, you have the missing time. Taking you back to the Waterfall, January 28th into January 29th, Do you know about what time it was when Mr. O'Keefe and the defendant came into the waterfall? It would have been, I think, between like 11 and closing. The stress indicated by repeating words is very consistent when referencing John O'Keefe. Anytime that O'Keefe is mentioned or that he is on Higgins's mind, you're going to get repeating words. That has been shown numerous times now, and I would expect that any reference to John O'Keefe at this point is going to cause repeating words. And then I bolded closing because I wasn't sure what time the bar closes. So when he says between 11 and closing, it means the bar closed at midnight, which is obviously why it was empty and why everyone was leaving. Why is that pertinent to us? You're going to see the word left a lot. When people say that they were leaving at that time, it doesn't necessarily indicate conflict. If the bar closed and they were still there at 12:01, means they're late to leave the bar, which means you're going to hear the word left a lot. And it's not an indicator of deception. Okay, now it's not the idea of him coming to the bar. This is him walking into the bar. Where were you situated in reference to the table when they came in? He says, so, explanatory statement, I expected this at this point. If we're tracking his level of stress, it should ratchet up a little bit every time O'Keefe gets closer to Higgins. Keep in mind that if Higgins had nothing to do with John O'Keefe's death, you wouldn't see anything in his language at this point. The fact that you're seeing deception-based stress in Higgins, and it's very predictably escalating, tells us we're definitively on the right track at this point, in that he had something to do with this. He says, so I think I was at the high top bar area, the high top in the bar area closest to the bar. So he's stumbling on his sentence as well as O'Keefe enters. Higgins' presence, Higgins' stress is up to explanatory statement plus 4 eyes, which is pretty high.
And do you recall sort of where you were situated in reference to the table when they came in?
So I think I was at the high top bar area, the high top in the bar area closest to the bar.
Where did they go when they first came in? Right off the bat, explanatory statement. When they first came in, I believe they may have initially went in, like veered off in a different direction. I recall that she opened her coat and took a drink out of it. Glass. All right. I recall is important to us. When he says, I recall that she opened her coat, this is extremely important. When somebody's inserting information that wasn't asked for in the question, it means it's important to them. Why is it important to him? In this case, I recall is a qualifier that is unnecessary. If he didn't recall it, then he couldn't say it. So to restate the word recall indicates sensitivity and possibly deception. If the deception is not related to the existence of the item in question, then it's related to the motive behind mentioning the item. This information of bringing a glass into the bar is pointed information that is out of place because Lally didn't ask if she brought a drink into the bar. This is an attempt to build up the prosecution's case, which is deflection. He's saying she was drunk. He's well aware of the fact that prosecution is arguing that Karen Reed was drunk and hit John O'Keefe and killed him. So he is now beginning to build their case for them without ever having been asked. Higgins jumping the gun on this information is an indicator of a guilty conscience. Higgins is attempting to create a fall guy in Reed. It's very common to try and create a fall guy when you're the guilty party. You want the attention to be put onto someone else. And if somebody else happens to get blamed for it, you're going to do everything in your power to ensure that that person takes the fall. What, if any, observations did you make of the glass that Miss Reed took out of her coat? We get linguistics in here. I'm going to play this video for you.
I recall that she opened her coat and took a drink out of it. I should say a glass.
And what, if any, observations did you make of the glass that Miss Reed took out of her coat?
It was a tall glass. It looked like a clear liquid in there.
For you. The linguistics is another indicator that Higgins is case building against Reed, which is again an indicator of guilt. He says it was a tall glass. He's insinuating with his tone that she was drinking an ungodly amount of alcohol. Then he says it looked like a clear liquid in there. What he's implying, now it's not what he's saying. He's implying this. If he doesn't say it, it means it didn't happen. If it did happen, he would have just said it. It was a tall glass and it looked like it was clear liquid in there. The implication is that she has like a beer stein full of vodka, which would, kill a normal person. It would kill me at my age. This is building on the previous statement. Again, Higgins has jumped the gun on saying clear liquid. Higgins is just firing on all cylinders here. He wasn't asked. what was in the glass. And so the fact that he jumps the gun again is reaffirming that he is doing everything in his power to build this case against Karen Reed. And he's not even willing to wait for the questions to come. At some point, you have occasion to have a conversation with Mr. O'Keefe. Before we read this, you've seen things escalating. I'm sure at this point you can only imagine what the verbiage is going to look like. Let's see. He says, I did, like, I can't even, I'm just going to have to play that for you because it was just a bunch of syllables. Then he says, I don't know that if it was initially when he first came in, but I did have a brief conversation with him. As to the content, I don't recall what that was. This is
Now, after you make those observations, at some point over the course of the time that you were at the Waterfall and they were there as well, then you have occasion to have a conversation with Mr. O'Keefe.
I did. I don't know that if it was initially when he first came in, but I did have a brief conversation with him as to the content. I don't recall what that was.
Is small talk fair to say?
Greetings.
Is small talk fair to say?
Greetings.
This is really fundamentally important to this. We have quadruple eyes here. As Higgins engages in conversation with O'Keefe, we get up to 4 eyes now. The level of stress is an indicator of deception. The other thing that we want to note here, we already have an indicator that recall has been used deceptively in a previous question. So it is likely to be an indicator of deception in this answer as well. I recall here was unnecessary information that had a motive behind it. Now he says, I don't know that if it was initially when he first came in, and then he says, as to the content, I don't recall what that was. The I don't know is in reference to time, which could be an honest statement there. He might not know exactly when the conversation started in comparison to when O'Keefe came in, but I don't recall is not a truthful statement here. As to the content, he should have said, I don't know what we talked about. That would have continued with the level of honesty that he had here, but he says, I don't recall what that was. The change of language from I don't know to I don't recall is an indicator of deception regarding the content of the conversation. The I don't recall was extra information that wasn't asked for in the question, which makes it sensitive information that indicates missing time or missing information. You can't say, I don't know, when someone didn't ask the question. If somebody says, what did you have for breakfast? And you say, I don't know what I had for dinner. They didn't ask you what you had for dinner, so I don't know isn't appropriate. I don't recall is an indicator of deception, the way that it's used here. And then, this is nice, we get a follow-up question, just small talk, fair to say? Again, Lally is trying to help Higgins. He should have asked, did you guys have a little bit of an argument there? I mean, that would be a relevant question. When he says, just small talk, is that fair to say? He's expecting a yeah, and let's move on, and let's get the focus off of this conversation of you with O'Keefe. But Higgins can't say it. He can't say yes. He says greetings. So what does that mean? He just said he doesn't know what it was. So it definitely wasn't greetings. Higgins just said he didn't recall the content of the conversation. If the conversation were actually greetings, he would have mentioned that in the first question. His necessity to label the mystery conversation at this point as greetings is extremely sensitive and is highly deceptive. This conversation likely led directly to a confrontation between the two of them later. It's really, really important to understand the gravity of what we just looked at here. This paints a picture for us. As the two of them come together, there is a conversation that's extremely sensitive. Only a guilty conscience will cause you to inject information that could be incriminating before it's even asked for. He says, as to the content, I don't recall what that was. When nobody asked him about the content, that's an indicator of a guilty conscience. This is an indicator of deception. Then when Lally says small talk, fair to say, now Higgins feels like it's time to actually label this so that this doesn't turn into something. But he doesn't realize that he says he doesn't recall what the content was. And now he says he does recall what the content was. It was greetings. So tremendous amount of deception. Again, the I don't know and the I don't recall, as well as being deceptive in the change of language. Those are also phrases that mean missing time. When somebody says, I don't know, or I don't recall, it means there's a piece of information there that is missing. And the I don't recall means it is missing and it's important and I'm not going to tell you.